I want to welcome you to those who are joining us online, as well as those guys on seat. You know, here at Boulevard, what we want each week for you to walk away from here is to be equipped to make better decisions so that you can have a brighter future. And that's what this series is all about, in the pursuit of happiness. It's not about dancing. I'm taking dancing lessons now so that sometime in the next 25 years you can see me on film again. Don't hold your breath. You know, I'm sure that there are things in your life, I know this is true, that bother you, right? And the reason I know there are some things that bother you is I have read your posts on rants on Facebook from time to time, and so I know there's some things that bother you. But you narrow that down a little bit more, there are some things within our life that when we see them, when we hear about them, it just breaks your heart, right? It's not as wide of a variety of things, but there are some things that just breaks your heart. I want to tell you, as a pastor, there are some things that absolutely breaks my heart. And one thing in particular that gets me is when I watch people make decisions that I know they're absolutely going to undermine their own happiness. It's like watching a car accident getting ready to happen, and you just kind of, oh man, you know, I can see the way couples sometimes treat each other, and you know, I think, not judgmentally, but I think, I know what's on the horizon. You know, their happiness is getting eroded. The foundation is getting eroded right there. I've seen people in situations at work, or I hear their attitudes coming from work, and I know that it's not going to be many more days to where that whole situation is just going to go south on them, because their attention is pointed into a particular direction. When your attention gets fixated on something, you go in that direction. And whatever direction you go on, ultimately that's going to be your destination in life. And that destination is not going to be a happy place, all right? It's going to be an unhappy place, because your attention gets fixated on certain things that erodes or undermines your happiness in your life. And that, it just breaks my heart. I mean, there's enough unavoidable pain within our life that I hate us throwing into our life avoidable pain. You know, Jesus said famously, it's not a verse. As a matter of fact, I don't know of anybody that puts this particular verse, you know, on the refrigerator, or puts it up on their car, or writes it on their mirror, or anything like that. He says, in this world, I want you to know, in this world, you're going to have trouble, all right? You're going to have trouble. Anybody doubt that? Now, we always act surprised, don't we? Oh, I can't believe that came into my life. But in this world, we're going to have problems. We're going to have trouble. That's unavoidable. And so there's this unavoidable trouble that's going to come into our life. But all too often, we make decisions that send us in a direction that's going to ultimately undermine our happiness. And so why put things there when we're going to have to deal with some trouble to begin with? And I think all this thing on avoidable things that undermine happiness falls around two particular words. It's these two words right here. Maybe. This is one of those unavoidable. Are we having trouble with this morning? Okay, two words. Here we go. Would you say them with me? Pleasure and happiness, all right? There's a lot of confusion around these two particular words. What do they mean? How do they live out in our life? Pleasure and happiness. And so this morning, as we end this series about the pursuit of happiness, what we want to do is talk about the relationship between these two words, pleasure and happiness. And I want us to just kind of jump right into the text this morning. I'm not going to give you a lot of background. It's a text that if you've been in church for a long time, you've probably heard it a number of times within your life. And even if you've never been in church, you've probably heard this phrase before. It's a phrase that Jesus tells in the midst of his teaching. And one of his best friends, John, who wrote a biography about Jesus, known as the Gospel of John, he mentions this. And Jesus is doing some teaching, and just like sometimes when I teach, you look out in the audience and you think, I'm not connecting. Woo-hoo. Anybody home out there? You know, and so there's times when that happens, and so you change illustrations or you change metaphors or something of that nature in order to get people's attention back. And I think that's what Jesus does here. He starts out talking about one thing, and all of a sudden, bam, he kind of throws this other illustration, and he grabs their attention. And here's what he says in John chapter 10, verse 10. He says this, the thief comes only to what? Steal, kill, and destroy. Who's heard that before? Okay, almost everybody here, we've heard that. The thief comes to kill, steal, kill, and destroy. I'm going to get my southern accent in there. We'll make that into several syllable word. Now, who's the thief in this? Well, it could be Satan, could be several different things. A thief is someone who comes into a person's life, anyone's life. A thief is the person who steps into anyone's life and as a result steals something of value, kills something of value, or destroys something valuable within your life. It can be something specific, it can be something in general. And when you think about life, anyone that steps into your life, anyone who intersects with your life, and as a result of that relationship, something is stolen, something is killed, something is destroyed, Jesus would say within that context, that was a thief. Now, here's the tricky part. Here's the part that I probably am going to lose half of you because you're going to be mad at me from here on out, all right? This is a challenge. I'm laying down the challenge to you, all right? So I want you to think about this for just a second and hang on because it's going to be a little bit of a downer for a few moments. But let me ask you this in this way. Who in your life has the greatest capacity or the most potential to steal your future away from you? Who in your life has the greatest capacity to kill off a relationship or destroy your life? I mean, when you think about your own personal life, who in your life has the potential, the most potential to take something you want, steal it from you, destroy something in your life, or kill a relationship? And I believe the answer is the same for every person in the room. What the answer is, it's the person who's the central figure in your next selfie. Are you following me? It's the person that you're going to be, it's going to be the one that everything focuses on. Next time you take a selfie and post it on Facebook, that is the person that's going to have the most potential to kill, steal, and destroy your life. And that person is you. Now, I know you like to say you because you're going to point to me, and you're going to think I'm the one that has that biggest potential. The answer is me, myself, and I, all right? So you or me has the biggest potential to be able to kill something within our life, steal something, the future from our life, or destroy it. And we say it in lots of different ways. How many times have you said in your life, I'm my own worst enemy? Can I see your hands on that one? I'm my own worst enemy. That's right. Here's the bad news as we get started, all right? You are your own worst enemy. And you've done more to undermine your own happiness than anyone else in this room or in your world. You have the capacity to do more to undermine your happiness than anyone else. And here's how I know that, all right? Because here's how I know that you have that capacity to do it. Because at one time or another, you have bought it, you have leased it, you have ate it, you've drank it, you've smoked it, you've dated it, you may have slept with it, and some of you married it, okay? You have the capacity to undermine your happiness more than any other person. And you did it to yourself. You did it to yourself. And when you think about your own unhappiness, you were there and present for all that stuff. The one common denominator for all the garbage that's within your life is you were the person that was there. And the truth is, we are our own worst enemy. The thief is the one that comes into your life and steals something, steals your future, kills something, like kills a potential relationship, or destroys something. So in some capacity, you and I are oftentimes that person that's the thief that Jesus is talking about. Now, Jesus makes this extraordinary statement that follows that. It's just like the supreme contrast. And he says, in contrast to the thief that he was just talking about, I have come that they, now the they that he's talking about here is the first century audience that he was talking with, and also they meaning they be you, all right? You may have life. In contrast to the thief, I have come so that you may have life. And then Jesus adds this little phrase that's just like a boom, punch. And he says, and have it to the what? Full. I like that. I don't know how many of you grew up in church, Probably if you did, heard the King James Version, okay? Tell me if you remember, and I think most of you do, what that verse says in the King James. I've come that you may have life and have it more abundantly. Man, you guys are great. Many of you King James people around there, huh? Okay, all right, so he says that you might have it to the full or more abundant. It's a really interesting little Greek word, parison, and it means basically, the lexicon says pertaining to that which is not ordinarily encountered. Now, what he means is we have a certain measure. We have a bucket that we want full. And what God says is, I'm going to fill that bucket, but it's going to be filled to the top and overflowing. Or you've got an expectation, or you've got a thing that you think is average. What Jesus says is, I have come that you may have life and even more. It's more than you can possibly understand, comprehend. It's going to be abundantly beyond that, all right? It's more than you can normally encounter. And what Jesus is saying is, if you will follow me, I will give you a life. As you walk with me, as you learn to make decisions like I make decisions, as you learn to build up your happiness and sow towards happiness, you're going to have a life that is uncommon. And when people look at your life, they're going to say, I don't get it. They're not that great a person. They haven't had a life that's not without problems in their life. Everybody has some problems. You know, they've had hardship and things of that nature. It's not that they've gotten what they've wanted all the time. The difference is something internal that's made its way into the way you do life. And Jesus says, I've come that you might have life. And life that is so abundant, it's outrageous, all right? Then he goes on to say in verse 11 this. He says, I am what? The good shepherd. Now, this means nothing to most of us in this room. How many of you have sheep out on your front lawn this morning? Can I see your hands? I don't see anybody. How many even have them in their backyard? Okay, nobody here. How many of you are shepherds? None of you here. So it's a metaphor that we don't get because we're not dealing with the sheep and goats. Now, some of you deal with goats and FFA and things like that, but none of you deal with sheep on a regular basis. And so it's a metaphor that we don't quite comprehend like their first century audience did. I mean, when they said sheep and shepherd, they went, oh yeah, I know a lot about that. Because every one of them had sheep. Every one of them had something to do with sheep and shepherds. And so he says, I am the good shepherd. And then he goes on, he says, I'm not just the average shepherd, I'm the good shepherd. How good am I? I am the good shepherd that lays down his life for the sheep. Now, if someone is willing to lay down their life for you, I would have to say that they are for you, wouldn't you? Wouldn't you say that? If someone is willing to give their life for you, they are for you. And this stands in sharp contrast to what the thief does. What did Jesus say the thief does? He comes to steal, kill, and destroy. And the shepherd comes in order to give you life. And not only that, he says, I'm willing to lay down my life for you so that you can have a better life. Now, it's such a big contrast that Jesus is basically saying, you have a decision to make. Are you going to follow the thief? Are you going to follow him who's out to destroy you, who's out to kill you? Or will you decide that Jesus really is the good shepherd and follow the one who is for you? Friends, look at me for just a second. This is something that sometimes I think we forget in the pain of life. Sometimes we forget that in the midst of the unavoidable trouble that we have in life, and that is that Jesus is for you. Would you say that with me? Jesus is for you. Actually, turn to the person next to you because he doesn't really believe it. Say it to them, all right? Now, here's the hard part. We have fun telling somebody else, yeah, Jesus is for you. But the real issue is whether or not you believe that Jesus is for me. Because we know the stupid things we have done, right? Now, here's where it hurts. We love the Good Shepherd analogy. We love the idea that Jesus is our Good Shepherd. But there is something that's really offensive in this passage. And that is that Jesus compares you to a sheep. Anybody been around a sheep? Some of you have. Have you ever seen the south end of a northbound sheep? They're pretty dirty. They don't know how to take care of themselves. They haven't a clue what a bath means. As a matter of fact, once they get in the water, they often can't get out because the water weighs down their fur, their wool, and they sink, all right? They sink. And so sheep have been known down through the years of not being all that smart. And that's why it's kind of offensive. What Jesus is saying is, I'm the good shepherd, and you be the dirty, stupid sheep. Okay? So this is offensive. If Jesus is the shepherd, who's the sheep? Yeah, we are. But you shouldn't be too offended, because you had a part in this also. Remember, you bought it, you smoked it, you slept with it, and you made it your wife, okay? And you probably are glad that this morning we don't have a video of all the bad, dumb things that you have done in life, all right? Bottom line, if you're a sheep, you've made some bad decisions in your life. I waited this whole sermon to say that one line. I want you to know that. Okay. I will do anything for applause. All right. Jesus knows what he's talking about. And oftentimes, I am my own worst enemy. But Jesus says, I am the good shepherd. And as offensive as it is to think of yourself as a sheep, I'm asking you to follow me. Now, here's the thing. At times, you're your own worst enemy, but you are not your only enemy. And when I said the thief, some of you immediately said Satan. And he's behind a lot of this. And for those of you who are Christians, you understand this really well. And for those of you who are considering Christianity, the author of the New Testament, the different authors of the New Testament wrote those letters that we contain what we call the New Testament. Personify this word right here, the word sin. Gee, I thought that red would show up a whole lot better. Now here's what sin does, all right? Sin means you miss the mark. Sin means you're a stupid sheep who makes some bad decisions in your life, okay? Sin also separates. It's one of the bad things that sin does. It separates us. It separates us from ourselves. Part of the reason that you are schizophrenic in your life, and every one of us are. Schizophrenic meaning that we say we believe one thing and we do something else. Part of the reason that you and I are hypocrites. Yes, we all are. We really are. Because we say we profess one thing and we don't live out that belief within our life. Sin separates us at our very core. And that leads to some psychological problems in almost all of us. And some of the issues that you have is because sin has divided you down and you no longer know what your real identity is. You've forgotten how God made you because you've followed not Jesus, but you followed a sin path for a long time, so you don't really even know who you are. Sin also separates us from others. Most of the relationships that have been killed off in your life has been a result of sin. Either some way that you have thought of the other person, which may or may not have been true, or some way they have thought of you, which may or may not have been true, or something that you did, your behavior, separated you from other people. Sin separates. Sin also separates us from God, and that's the way we normally think of it. God is a holy God, and while he loves us and he does everything he can to bring that relationship closer in our life, sin puts separation between you and I. He and I, and you and him. We foul things up. We build up walls. And it's not because God has put the walls there. It's because whenever I sin, I fear that coming out. I want to hide it. And so I build all these walls between myself and God. And it's not that God is not trying to reach out for me, but I push him away so much because for some reason, I don't want him to know when, hey, stupid sheep that I am, he already knows it anyway. The thing that we have hidden in the closet and tried to keep under the covers for so long, it's open scandal in heaven. Sin separates. It separates us from ourselves, it separates us from others, and it separates us from God. And so we have this enemy within, and you have an enemy without. The enemy within is yourself. You bought it, you know the rest of the deal. And the enemy without is Satan, and we have this deal within our life, and I've heard you say it, and some of you say it many times, and I've said it myself, I can't live with myself. If I ever did that, I would not be able to live with myself, and I've done that. So what does that mean? It means internally there's this separation when certain things happen within our life, because sin always, 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 always separates. Now, the thing is we know this. I mean, everything I've said this morning, you already know that. I mean, you're not saying, wow, that's unbelievable. You're so smart. I can't believe you figured that out. Every one of us know that. I undermine my own happiness. You're not saying, I had no idea, because you know that. And you're just hoping that right now that I don't call upon you and say, hey, come on up here, and in 30 seconds, I want you to rattle off all the stupid sheep-like things that you have done, all right? Some of you are going, oh, is he not going to do that? Is he? I know he's crazy. But we have been wandering around like a herd of unguided sheep for a long time in our life. Why is that? Why is it that you do dumb things over and over and over and over again like a bunch of sheep? Well, a big part of that dynamic, and this is true whether you're a Christian or you're not a Christian, whether you're religious or not religious, it really doesn't matter. It's true for all of us. It's just life. This is just a people thing. A big part of our confusion is around those two words that we talked about earlier, pleasure and happiness. At the center of most temptation is the confusion about the relationship between pleasure and happiness. Pleasure and happiness. Now, all right, here's where it gets fun, and this is where I'm sure I'm going to tick a few of you off, but that's okay, all right? That's my job. One of my spiritual gifts is annoying people, and I'm really good at it, all right? Here's the deal. You know that God created some things within our lives, created with some things within the context of life that are meant to be pleasurable, right? You know that? Okay? And God created you and me to experience pleasure. And he created us with the capacity to experience happiness within our life. Think about this, if you will. God created sexual pleasure. Oh, no, he just said the three-letter word in church, right? God made that up. It was God's idea. Like, towards the end of creation, he's like, I've got a great idea. And he brings the angels around them. And the angels go, what? And God says, you know, you may not understand this because angels don't actually understand sex. But anyway, it's another topic for another sermon. He says, see all those animals running around reproducing? We're going to add a little something to the human race here in just a second. And this will be something, it's going to get them in a lot of trouble, but it'll bring a lot of pleasure and some happiness also. So in some capacity, I know you don't want to laugh because you're not supposed to laugh at anything said sex in church, all right? But in some kind of cosmic way, God created sexual pleasure. Can I get an amen on that? Oh, that was an enthusiastic one. Amen. Get this. Jesus made wine. He made it right up front. I've got lots of amens in my life, but that's a great one. Some people consider it his first miracle, all right? It's like, all right, let's get this ministry started, you know. Should I heal somebody? Nah, let's make some wine. And perhaps the angels were saying, are you sure that's the place to start, Jesus? Now, hold on with me, all right? The point is that God created the capacity for pleasure, just like he created the capacity for happiness. And God is not against pleasure any more than God is against happiness. The problem is it's not an either or. The issue is priority. When we prioritize pleasure over happiness, you get neither. You get neither one. The truth is, one does lead to the other, but if the priority is not correct, if you're not searching for happiness, it will lead to pleasure if you seek God's happiness within your life. Happiness can and will ultimately lead to pleasure. But if you're seeking pleasure first, it will not ultimately lead to happiness. In fact, I believe that it leads happiness, if you pursue it in God's manner, it leads to maximum pleasure in this life. But if you pursue pleasure and ignore the principles that lead to happiness, at the end of the day, you will be neither happy nor pleased. Because eventually, and you know this as well as I do, eventually pleasure loses its pleasure and becomes what? A prison, because of the law of diminishing returns. You used to take a half a glass, then a whole glass, then 2 glasses, then 3 or 4 or 5 or 6, and now you're yelling at people and you don't even remember the event at all. What happened? You allowed the pleasure to become a priority. And when that happens within your life, it becomes your master. When pleasure becomes a priority, pleasure loses its pleasure and becomes a master. What begins as a pastime often begins a pathway. It becomes a habit, and it becomes an addiction within your life. And oftentimes it becomes prison bars that surround your life. And when these are not addressed, when the priority gets out of whack, then you are in a prison, and it undermines all happiness within your life. And these aren't necessarily things that are illegal or immoral, but in your life and in my life, when we prioritize any pleasure over the priority of loving the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, it ceases to become a pleasure and it becomes your master. As we learned last week, no one can serve 2 masters. You'll either hate one and love the other, or you'll despise one and be devoted to the other. And the issue within most of our lives is we have prioritized pleasure, and it has become our master, and we serve it. Now, 25 years after Jesus' resurrection, a man who became known as the Apostle Paul walked onto the scene. And he took Jesus' principles, he took what Jesus said, and he took them into the Gentile world, and he used some different illustrations to be able, so the Gentiles could understand, because Jesus was Jewish, and most of the context of what he had to say came out of the Jewish law and things of that nature. And so Paul stretched some of those principles so that the Gentile mind could understand it. You and I are Gentiles. Here's what Paul says in the same idea. Paul comes up and he says, in Romans chapter 6, verse 16, he says, don't you know, there's things I love about the Apostle Paul. I think of all the writers of the New Testament, I think I like Paul the best, just because some of the things that he has. And whenever he says, don't you know, he's basically going to lead you through a series of things to get you to logically say, hey, yeah, that's common sense, all right? And so each time you see Apostle Paul say that, he's going to go on this line of argument that's trying to help you come back around and say, hey, I understand. That makes common sense. That makes you right. So he says, don't you know that when you offer yourself to someone as obedient slaves, yours as slaves are the one you obey? Okay, everybody agree with that? What he's saying is put it not just in terms of slavery in the sense of you being the slave of someone else. What he's also saying is that whenever you become so enmeshed in a pleasure that it becomes your priority in life, guess what you become? A prisoner of that deal. You become a slave of that pleasure. Now, he says, whether you're slaves of the one you obey, whether slaves to sin, which leads to death, or to obedience, which leads to what? Righteousness. So let's break this down a little bit. Don't you know that when you offer, I'll take one of those, I'll take one of those, I'll take one of those, I'll take one of those. Ooh, I like that. That brings me pleasure. Let me take several of those. I'll take 25 of those, and I'll take 65 of these. Whenever I do that, I say yes, 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 yes to the pleasure. Don't you know that when you offer yourself to someone or something as obedient slaves, Your slaves are the one to obey. So he says, if you continue to say yes to a pleasure over and over and over and over and over, don't you realize that you're becoming a slave to that pleasure? And you're thinking right now as I say that, I'm not a slave. I'm choosing. You know, like most 4-year-olds, sometimes you think you're choosing, you're just a slave. And Paul says, that's my point. Don't you know that choosing the same thing over and over and over and over again, you're no longer choosing. You're being drawn in. You're giving up control. You're behaving like a slave. You're behaving as if you have to, not simply you want to. And every time pleasure comes knocks on the door of your life, and you answer the door, you're a slave to that pleasure. And Paul says that you start missing the mark. You start sinning. That pleasure becomes a sin in your life. And sin leads to death. It leads to separation. James chapter 1, verse 15 talks about the fact that when temptation comes knocking around, it's like a lure. It's like something to bring us in. And when that temptation gets into our life, it gives birth to sin, and sin leads to death in our life. And that's the reason in some areas of your life right now, you're living a death-like experience. Because sin has separated you from life. Sin kills. It always kills. It kills the way you view yourself. It kills your marriage. It kills your relationship with your kids. It kills your relationship with your employers. Sin always kills stuff. And wherever there is sin, listen to me, wherever there's sin, something's dying. It's dying. It's being destroyed. And the last part of Romans 6, verse 16, Paul says, you either offer yourselves to slaves to sin, which leads to death, or here's where you want to tune in, there's an alternative. You can offer yourself to obedience to God, which leads to righteousness. Now, righteousness is just a fancy New Testament word that means to have a right relationship or a right standing with God. Look, every single day of your life, you and I are offering ourselves as a slave either to sin or a slave to obedience. And when you continue to say yes, 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 yes to pleasure over and over and over and over, you become a servant to, you become a slave to that pleasure. And when pleasure takes precedence, priority over the principles of happiness, ultimately you neither have happiness nor pleasure. And here's why this is so important, okay? And here's where we get in trouble. We feel unhappy. Anybody ever felt unhappy? Yeah. It's a common experience, isn't it? We have moments of unhappiness. Maybe sometimes you interpret it as boredom. We feel unhappy. And so we have to figure out how not to be unhappy. And maybe it's not really that we're unhappy. It's maybe that we're just kind of out of sorts. And so you want to do something to make you feel better, right? Common experience, right? And that's what gets us in trouble. I'm unhappy, so I'm going to go shopping. There's no grins on your faces. I'm unhappy, so I'm going to look at pornography. I'm unhappy, so that I got to have some fix for my lack of happiness. So I'm going to go out and drink some of the wine that Jesus created, but I'm going to drink more and more and more and more and more till I can't feel any pain at all. And here's what Jesus says, is that when we make decisions that ultimately undermine our own happiness, we don't get happiness nor pleasure. Whenever we say, I'm unhappy, so I need a pick-me-up, I need a quick fix, you're in trouble. And Jesus' message to us when we are unhappy, he says, listen to me, there is no quick fix to happiness. You sow and you reap your way there. And as long as you're saying yes to pleasure over and over and over and over and over and over to something or somehow having a quick fix for your lack of happiness, ultimately you're undermining your own happiness. And this is why you'll hear us say from time to time, from this pulpit, following Jesus will make your life better. Following Jesus will make you better at life. It's why Jesus said, I'm the good shepherd. You can trust me following me. Jesus says following me will make your life better, and ultimately following Jesus will make you better at life. But it's neither instant nor a quick fix. You sow and you reap your way there. Okay, I've got to close by asking you a couple of tough questions. You said you've asked enough those today, James. Just leave me alone, all right? Here's a probing question, and I want you to answer this question for you. This is not for me. It's not for anybody else in the room. It's for you. As I said earlier, the thief of happiness in your life is who? Me, right? You. So answer this question for you. You owe it to yourself, and you owe it to those who love you. And here's the question. Is there a pleasure that's undermining your happiness? Right now in your life, is there a pleasure that's undermining your happiness? Is there a pleasure that you've said yes to so many times that's beginning to undermine your happiness? Is there a pleasure that if you continue to say yes to, it's going to undermine not only your happiness, it's going to undermine the people around you, the people that you care for the most. It's going to undermine their happiness also. Is there a pleasure that every once in a while your daughter says to you, Mom, why do you always, and you fill in the blank. Dad, why do you, and you fill in the blank. Is there a pleasure that has begun to undermine your happiness? And if you continue to say yes to that pleasure, you are a thief. You're in opposition to Jesus' invitation to follow him as the good shepherd. Now let me ask it in a different manner. Is there a pleasure that's slowly overtaking you and taking you prisoner? Is there a pleasure? It may be legal or illegal. It may be moral or immoral. It doesn't matter. Is there a pleasure that's slowly taking you prisoner? That pleasure can be an addiction, but it may not be to drugs or alcohol or pills or anything like that. It can be an addiction to bitterness in your life. You're really upset because of something that's happened in your life in the past, and you are so addicted to that bitterness in your life that it's slowly destroying you. No one knows the answer to that question but you. And you don't have to answer it for anybody but yourself. But here's what I want you to know. One day you'll wish that when that pleasure is knocking at the door, you'll wish that you quit answering the door. You wish that you had stopped. Because every time you answer the door, it puts you back in prison. And one day you're going to look back and say, why in the world am I so unhappy? And you'll discover in that moment, as many of you are discovering right now, that you have become your own worst enemy. You are the thief in your life. And perhaps by God's grace today, you would be willing to trade your pleasure for a shepherd who will not drain the life out of you, but a good shepherd who's come into this world to give you life and life more abundant, a life that is not commonly encountered. Now, let me take it a step further, okay? Guys, just a minute. I want you to look this way. Ladies, you can talk among yourselves, make your grocery list. Don't make your shopping list. That would be pleasure, okay? So, guys, I understand. I'm a man. Believe it or not, I was a man before I was a pastor. I know some people think pastors are not really men. They're kind of weird people, things of that nature. But I am one. And what I know about you and I as men is when I hear something like that, what we've just heard today, here's my internal response. I say to myself, yeah, I need to do better. But it's my way of doing nothing. In fact, you may be so good at this that when you leave the building today and you get in the car and you know your wife's going to want to discuss this morning's sermon, and you will preempt her. You'll say, yeah, honey, I know. There's some things in there about pleasure. I got to get better at that. And you're going to see her smile. And you go, yes, I put it off for another 3 weeks. Now, inside you may be thinking, yeah, I do need to get better at this. But it's really a byword for saying, I'm not going to do anything about it. Just going to push it off. Now, guys, look up here for just a minute. You and I hold not only the future of our own happiness in our hands, you hold the future happiness of your children, maybe your grandchildren. The future happiness of your marriage is all within your hands. And now's not the time to say, yeah, I need to do better. Now's the time to take some extreme measures within your life. Because if you do nothing, you will be robbed. And they will be robbed. And you have the vast potential of killing a relationship and perhaps even killing yourself. Now, guys, I know we don't need anything at all because we're so self-efficient. But for most of us, what we just talked about will require some extreme measures within our life. I've got a group that I meet with, and one of the principles that we've been studying from a book called Experiencing God is that when we read the Word of God, we're going to be exposed to some things within our life that is going to bring a crisis within our life, crisis in our faith. And we will have to make some adjustments in our life in order to continue to serve God. And that's not just for men. Ladies, you can start listening now. Because you also have that same future within your hands. Your own, your children, and your grandchildren. And what I'm saying is, before you leave this building, pleasure's going to come knocking. Where are you going to prioritize it? The whole thing of this series comes down to one thing. Your happiness depends upon your priority and how you live it out. And as we said in week 1, that priority, the only priority for a follower of Jesus, is to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. That is your whole priority. And anytime any other priority, pleasure, whatever it is, gets over that, your happiness potential goes and sinks. And so, guys, if you're a follower of Jesus this morning, you got a decision to make. Are you going to believe that Jesus is your good shepherd? Are you going to continue to allow thieves to come into your life and steal and kill and destroy you? I want you to walk away from other thieves in your life. Because Jesus is the only good shepherd. He's the only one that can promise you life, and life to the full. Life abundantly. A life like nobody else has ever encountered. A life when people look at it and say, I don't understand it. But there's something inside of that guy. There's something inside of that gal. So let's just do this. I got an idea. Let's prioritize our happiness over our pleasure. And then you get the best of both worlds. And if you continue to prioritize your pleasure over your happiness, ultimately you'll get neither. So what's one? Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. Let's pray together. Father, this is so heavy. It's much easier, Father, me to just stand up here and talk about it than it is for me to actually walk off this stage and do it. And so for all of us, Father, it's a daily struggle. And yet we know that Paul is exactly right. Don't you know? Yeah, we do know. And so would you give us the wisdom to know what to do with what we know? Give us the wisdom to know what to do with what we've just heard. And then give us the courage to do so. And Father, I especially pray for the men here this morning, because for whatever reason we seem to deceive ourselves so well. And I pray that in this moment will be a breakthrough for us. And Father, that we would surrender our lives to you, who's our good shepherd. Father, it's in Jesus' name I ask these things. In his name, amen.